You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galengo, and today we are here with a first-time topic and a first-time guest on the podcast. We have Geoffrey Moss, Master of Wine, here to talk about Canadian wine. Now, Geoff and I go back a little ways through the MW program, as well as working with him through Fine Vintage, and was actually able to spend some time with him at the MW seminar in the winter of 2025. And every time I've spoken with Geoff, he's just a wealth of knowledge on all fronts. Obviously, being a master of wine, he knows a lot of the ins and outs of wine and winemaking. He actually started his career on the production side, but studied a wide breadth of the wine industry. Now he's focusing primarily on the marketing and branding side. He's not just an expert in the terms of marketing and branding, but he is also a native Canadian and lives in the Okanagan Valley and is able to give us a unique insight from a Canadian wine point of view. I had talked to him for a while about which Canadian person I should have on to come on and talk about Canadian wines, and he was so enthusiastic and would talk about a number of people throughout Canada. And then he would share me little tidbits about what they could talk about on topics from the weather to the grape varieties to the styles. And I was just like, Geoff, why don't I have you on the podcast? So when I finally had him on, I was really excited to have him. He provides great insight into the wines and the styles grown throughout Canada, especially in the Okanagan Valley. It is much more diverse than I had anticipated. He gives us great insight into what different areas in the valley are growing and not only the good news of the great wines that they're growing, but also some of the not so good news with the climate impacts and the intense climate events that they've had. Recently, in 2024, there was an intense freeze and most of the region lost essentially all of their crops for the year. And it also had lasting impacts on the varieties that can be grown in the region. For example, it almost wiped out all of the Syrah, which was showing great promise. So it's really an interesting time in the Canadian wine industry because there's a lot of great wines being made, but a lot of long-term decisions that are going to be made for the region as well. And he's not only able to provide an insight into his backyard, the Okanagan Valley and the British Columbia wines, but he's also able to share some insight into the wines grown in the Niagara area and in the eastern part of Canada, and gives us a little sense of where the wines from each region are sold, who's consuming them, and the styles that are made. And I learned a ton about Canadian wine. I wish it was easier to get some down here in Los Angeles, but I'll head back up and have some because I've definitely enjoyed a lot of the wines that I've had from both ends of the country. So it was a great interview with Geoff. I hope everybody learns a lot. He also owns a wine brand called Soren, where he basically puts into practice a lot of the branding and marketing techniques that he recommends for his clients. He owns that with a partner who's a winemaker, and they source fruit not only from in Canada, but as far away as places like Aola, Amity Hills, and potentially will expand beyond the United States or North America, even in sourcing fruit and juice from elsewhere. So I hope everybody enjoys this interview with Geoff. He provides a Master of Wines level knowledge and a really deep insight into Canada and its wines. So without further ado, here is Geoff Moss, Master of Wine. Hi, Geoff. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you on. I would love to have you give a little bit of background to our listeners on who you are and how you got into the wine industry, and then we'll talk about the projects that you're working on currently.
I'm an Okanagan-based master of wine, one of three in the Okanagan. And I guess I've always worked in wine. It was kind of my first career. I wouldn't say I naturally fell into it. It was something that happened after university. I was studying political science at university, and then obviously I thought at least I couldn't do much with a poli-sci degree. So I was like, oh, what do I do next? In my mind, it was I was going to be law school, but I always had this interest in food and wine. And that interest in food had come from before high school, just cooking at home, a lot of our family vacations were really centered around foods. With that came an interest in wine over time. So I'm in university, I'm about to graduate, trying to think about the next steps. So I applied to law school, I applied to grad school. And I was like, you know what, there's this winemaking and viticulture college program in Niagara in Ontario. And I thought if the full program tuition would be less than, I think, 3/4 of 1 year of law school. And so I felt this is like not super high risk. It sounds fun. And worst case scenario, hate it. And I can just go back, tail between my legs and do law school down the road. I ended up loving it. Found out probably pretty quickly that from a career perspective, the production side of the industry wasn't where my passion was, but through the program, so I had that kind of foundational background and knowledge. And then from there, pursued more sales and marketing.
Very interesting. So do you think while you're interested in wine production, do you think that background helped lay a foundation for you in the MW side, since you need to have that depth of production knowledge and specificity as well?
I think so. I think it was a big leg up to have that background, to have both the theoretical background, but then to have worked harvest, to have hands-on experience. I think it made a big difference because a lot of times it's difficult to translate textbook knowledge or textbook understanding like to practical understanding and what actually happens in a winery. And I always say it's weird in some cases. You look at job listings for a winemaking position and it says university degree required, or in some cases, college diploma required as a minimum. When in fact, if you talk to most winemakers, and they will never use any of that like college or university knowledge. It's there as a foundation, as a background. But to me, like winemaking is very much a trade as well as things you learn on the job. And I think having that experience too made a big difference to have like an understanding of this is what happens in real life and what winemakers are actually doing, not just like what a textbook says they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I never really thought of it as a trade. I'd interviewed another winemaker who was raised in France making wine in Oregon, but he hadn't heard the idea of wine being like an industry until he moved. It was always just part of culture, something you were like apprenticed into. It was a trade you picked up. That's a really interesting way of putting it. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's why you see like a lot of job postings have minimum university degree required. I just find it a little bit confusing because there's so many great applicants who have fantastic practical experience. And at the end of the day, university, you could probably say the same for so many things, even like a marketing perspective. Yes, you want a theoretical foundation or base to work from, but at the end of the day, a lot of it's just going to be like hands-on learning that's going to make the biggest difference.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I've had that debate specifically in marketing as someone with a marketing master's degree, and my friends who just stayed and worked in the agency world tell me I don't ever need it, but I feel you there. Speaking of branding and marketing, so that's the main thing that you do in the world of wine. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then you brought the two worlds together, and now you've established your own wine brand with a partner, and we'll talk a lot about that. And it's a Canadian wine brand, so we'll talk about Canadian wines as well.
So I said I've always worked in wine, and it's really always been on a sales and marketing side of the industry, specifically with a direct-to-consumer focus. I guess it was 6 years ago that I decided I was tired of working for other people and I wanted to be my own boss. And so I started a small agency called Lithica Wine Marketing. And so our big focus is on helping wineries with marketing and branding, but especially with direct-to-consumer sales and marketing. So that's where our experience and expertise lies. And so with that in mind, a handful of years ago, also started a small wine brand called Syrah. I think part of it could be just a general distaste for money because it's not super, you don't even have to open up a spreadsheet or do a business plan to know you probably shouldn't start a winery. You probably shouldn't start or buy a vineyard or start a wine label. But to me, it was like part of being wine. I love everything about the wine industry. To me, that's like what attracted me to wine is the fact that it's that intersection of farming and agriculture. It's winemaking, the art of winemaking, but also chemistry. It's the sales and marketing and the business of wine. And so I think starting my own label, you get to see all of that come together. And so it's a lot of fun. And to me, it was also an important point because yes, I come from a wine background. I'm a master of wine, but I also wanted to demonstrate to some degree. It's like, here, I'm not just going to tell you what to do. I'm going to do my own recommendations and show that in practice too.
I hadn't thought of it that way. That's so good. It's like a proof of concept, a live case study for you.
That's how I view it. Like, you're my proof of concept. And I guess you can like my approach or dislike it, but at least I'm out there doing it. So at least I'm taking my own recommendations to heart.
Let's talk about the brand for a little bit. Can you share a little bit about your wines and the range and your partner as well?
Yeah, so I started Soren with my business partner, Ryan McKibben, who is a winemaker. I think we started in 2022 from memory. And it's really a négociant model. We've done everything so far. It started with a BC focus. The goal was really for it to be more of a global brand. So Soren is obviously a reference to Søren Kierkegaard in the existentialist philosophers, but also translates in Danish to soar. So the idea was we don't just want to be in BC, we want to be making wine around the world. So I guess it's like that old kind of like 1990s flying winemaker model. I like slightly reimagined, but we started in BC. And so we've done everything from purchasing young wine that we've matured, blended and bottled, blended, almost finished wine. We've bought grapes. So our latest release is from the Willamette Valley, from Eola Amity. And in that case, we bought from a friend, Shelby Perkins, in her vineyard, Brocken Vineyard in Eola Amity. So we've done everything, and that's been our approach, which has given us a lot of flexibility to basically try whatever we want. So every release is basically, so it's a one-off because we haven't repeated anything. So it's finding A, whatever interests us, and B, kind of what's available and at the quality level for what we're looking for.
Nice. Yeah. So when you're buying fruit like that, are you crushing it and I guess starting the processing down there, or are you trucking that? It's pretty far away from Eola Amity, which is like the bottom more of the Willamette itself.
Yeah, in this case, we worked with a winery in Eola Amity, and they custom crushed it for us.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then when you is it its whole life? The whole élevage is going to be down there, or are you guys going to truck it up eventually in juice form?
Brought it back is youngish wine. So in that case, that was 2024 vintage. We brought the wine back in April. We went down, kind of like put the blend together, brought it back in April, and then we just bottled it about a month ago, just over a month ago.
Oh, very cool. Is it Chardonnay or is it Pinot Noir?
We did Chard and Pinot. Yeah, so we have a whopping 44 cases of Chardonnay and 64 cases of Pinot.
You have Chardonnay from some of the... I've always loved Eola Amity Chardonnay, and it's only gotten better in the past 5-10 years. It's only really come onto the real scene for most people in that time.
I think it's one of my favorite Sorbets in the Willamette. And I'm not just saying that because, yes, that's where we made wine from. But I just love the wines. I think they have this beautiful tension to them. Very expressive, still have that kind of volcanic, distinctive minerality.
Yeah. So just for folks who aren't as in the bulk wine side of things, I always like, after working at the winery that I worked at in Australia and just seeing the different forms of wine moving around the world in bulk form, can you share a little bit about the maybe specifics about how you brought it up? Was it like a flexi tank, or was it, how did you do it?
Just because it's such small quantities, it was just in barrel. It wasn't, I'd like to say I think bulk wine is one of the most fascinating parts of the industry. It's certainly not the sexiest part of the industry or the most romantic. I could talk about bulk wine all day. We're not at those volumes where we're filling flexi tanks. Maybe one day, that would be nice. But no, basically, we had 5 barrels that we just heavily saran wrapped to make sure the bungs stayed in them. And then we had a minor crisis potential crisis, because the trailer was stuck at the border for an extended period of time because someone else on the truck, it was a shared container, someone else on the truck didn't clear their glass properly, and it was holding the whole shipment up, which would have been fine, except for it was about 35 degrees that day. It was going to be over the weekend. And so we started to sweat a little bit, both literally and figuratively, because, oh man, we don't know if this is going to be great. But anyways, we got bailed out because they took our barrels. Chuck brought them. Ended well.
Yeah, wow. And then for those listeners who aren't quick with Celsius, that's what, close to 90? 30?
Yeah, and that sounds right. It would be hot.
Yeah, my benchmark one way or another is, again, working at the winery in Australia. When the ferment got to 32, that was when we had to start cooling it down. And I was always like, yeah, that's probably a good idea.
I haven't personally tried like a Maderized wine from Eola Amity. So something that's like cooked and could have been the first of its kinds purposefully, but luckily we avoided.
Oh, that would have been cool. So what is so it's obviously négociant bespoke. Do you have anything that's annual or perpetual thing that you make every year, or is it always special vintage?
It's just one-offs at this point. Yeah, so we haven't repeated anything. So we'll see. That could change. We like to change our minds from time to time. But I think part of it is we both have our day jobs in a sense. And so this allows us to do whatever we want. Doesn't necessarily, like the volumes are at a point where it doesn't necessarily have to make sense in some ways. We're not like dealing with thousands of cases where we should have good business cases to make certain decisions. And so we can just like follow what excites us at any given time.
Cool. So let's take a step back there. Then you mentioned making BC wine, so British Columbia wine, and you're based in the Okanagan. I always say that wrong. Let's talk a little bit about the wine scene in general. So let's start in the Okanagan and then talk about Canada as a whole. And then, let's just go from there. Talk about Canadian wine.
Yeah. So we have in Canada 2 major wine producing countries or provinces, excuse me. So we've got Ontario and British Columbia. In British Columbia, the most important region by significant margin is the Okanagan Valley. So it makes up the vast majority of production within BC. And so I think the easiest way to think of it in some cases is almost as an extension of Walla Walla. So if you think about where Walla Walla is, we're roughly 5 hours north. In a similar climate, obviously we've gone 5 hours north, so it's shifted a little bit, but it's dry like Walla Walla. So we're in, people say desert. It's not quite a desert. It's more of a semi-arid climate. We don't get a lot of precipitation throughout the year, so we need irrigation. And then we also have a pretty extreme continental climate. Again, not unlike Walla Walla, where it gets extremely hot in the summer. And then we still have pretty pronounced winters, again, just like Washington. In our case, it depends. Like the typical winter would be, again, I'm going to use Celsius, would be right around freezing, plus or minus 5 degrees Celsius. There's been some exceptions lately because we've had some extreme winters, but that's kind of the framework where we're working. It's important to keep in mind, like, until you visit the Okanagan, it's a difficult or arguably a difficult region to understand because there's a lot of diversity. And that diversity comes from the fact that the valley is like roughly 200 kilometers north to south. So we're talking about a relatively large region, not in terms of like overall acreage or production. Like in terms of planted acres, we're right around 11,000 planted acres at the moment, but stretching over a huge distance. And so every time you have like a wine writer or journalist coming to the Okanagan, there's this mindset of what's the signature grape variety? And then the answer inevitably is there's not one. And so then you read a lot of articles after the fact, this could be the Okanagan signature grape variety, or what about this? But at this point, the Okanagan's strength is its diversity. I know there's a great case for trying to focus on a single variety, but again, it's stretching 200 kilometers north to south that makes that very difficult. On the north end, we're over 50 degrees latitude. If we think back to like our WSET entry courses, we're always taught wines produced or vineyards are planted between 30 to 50 degrees latitude. On the north end of the Okanagan, we're above that. And it's certainly a marginal climate in the sense that our average growing season temperature hovers between 14.5 to 15 degrees Celsius. So to put that in context, we're talking about varieties like Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling, and would put us like adjacent to places like Burgundy, certainly a little bit warmer than Champagne, but we're on the more cool end of the spectrum. And then we go 200 kilometers to the south. We're basically right on the US border, literally, and we're much warmer in contrast. So our average growing season temperature in the south has gone to about 18.5 degrees Celsius over the last handful of years. To put that in context, that's a warm climate, well suited to varieties like Syrah, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's a big difference, which would be more akin to, not quite, but more akin to places like Napa or Sonoma. And so how do you generalize a place that has diversity and that swing in temperatures from north to south? So probably the easiest way to look at it is in two chunks. So we have the North Okanagan, more our classic cool climate varieties, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling, like I said, and then South Okanagan, more late ripening reds. And that's where not only some Bordeaux reds are widely planted. In terms of overall plantings, it's Bordeaux reds in the south, but Rhone varieties, so both Syrah, but then whites like Viognier, Roussanne, Marsanne do extremely well.
Interesting. So I guess I'm trying to think of a parallel as one does to what they're more familiar with. So that kind of reminds me almost of Santa Barbara in a way that the area closer to the coast is cool. And then you have the Pinot Noir and the Chardonnay, but then as you get into like Ballard Canyon and Santa Ynez area, there's a lot more of that. It's really hot and they grow those red varieties. I think it's just sideways has people thinking that Pinot Noir is just growing everywhere in Santa Barbara. So they lucked out with that. But so when you're trying to explain a style, I guess either from the north or to the south of the wines to people, I know people don't want to say we make a Burgundy style this or a Sonoma style of that, but like, how would you describe the wines in character?
Probably it's a bit of a stretch, but if I had to generalize them, I would say the Okanagan is closest in character to Walla Walla or Washington. Reds, especially Bordeaux reds and Syrah, have a ripeness of fruit. Again, people think we're in Canada, it's got to be cold, it's got to be cool climates. There's nothing really cool climate at all about the South Okanagan. Again, you look at average growing season temperature, and it's decidedly a warm climate, and the growing degree days speak to that as well. So we're idling at high temperatures, again, because we're easily getting over 30 degrees, 35 degrees in the summer. So we have that combination of intense heat, but also very long days, again, because of our northerly latitude. So we're getting a lot of sunlight hours as well. Then that combination is giving us wines with this ripeness, fruit, typically with good acid because we do have strong diurnal rain, so cooler temperatures at night that are helping to preserve acidity to some degree at least. And then I think there is like a savoriness that carries through in the wines as well. So we have this beautiful combination of ripeness of fruit, but that's backed with underlying mineral tones. But often the wines can be quite floral and perfumed as well, especially the Syrah. And to me, the Syrah from the South Okanagan is really maybe the best performing grape on the whole. It's not the most widely performing grape, but the best performing grape because the wines are very distinctive. Feel like they should only come from here in the Okanagan. And then just this beautiful combination of kind of bright, black, bloom fruits, beautiful floral perfume, and then with those kind of meaty, spicy notes that feel like you're somewhere between Walla Walla and in the Northern Rhone.
Very cool. Very cool. Would you say, yeah, I guess that's interesting. I'm just trying to think of, would you say that in terms of volume, are those wines more widely produced or is it the Pinot Noir side? And I guess I'm going back to, and I'm from originally Virginia, and they had the same issue. For years, they tried to identify a grape or a style that they're most well known for. And they started with Viognier as the state grape, and that made absolutely no sense. And now I think Cab Franc is the flagship, even though everybody grows a little bit of everything. But would you say that's probably the most widely distributed style? Is those bigger reds, or is it the other styles?
Yeah, probably. It's important there's two things. The first is the most widely planted red varieties, Merlot. I think part of that is you have this mindset. So the Okanagan's a young region. The history tracks actually very similarly to like New Zealand and places like Marlborough. One arguably slightly more successful, at least on an export market than others.
So we're talking like the 1980s really getting going in a commercial sense. Is that right?
Yeah. Some of the first kind of commercial plantings in the mid to late 70s. And then it's not till the 80s and then into the 90s that things like move in significant ways. And historically, if you think of how the Okanagan started, in the 70s, it wasn't a question of, what big red should we plant? It was a question of, should we plant vinifera at all? Can we make quality wines from European grape varieties in the Okanagan? And so you look at those original plantings in the 70s, and they were experimental plantings. And even in the South Okanagan, where it's smoking hot, you had like Germanic and aromatic whites. Which today would be like, this does not make sense. But at the time, again, it was a question of, right here, it must be cool. We're going to plant our classic cool climate varieties, see if they survive the winter or not. And so we had that over probably 2 decades almost. And then a big shift in the early 90s. That in part was driven by NAFTA. So the Canadian government incentivized growers to pull up hybrids at the time and to replant to vinifera to move in a quality direction because of potential changes coming from NAFTA. And so with that, in the early 90s, you begin to see growers in the South Okanagan change what's planted. So you have some of the first Bordeaux reds planted in 1992, and a lot of them then followed throughout the early to mid 90s. So this big paradigm shift. Again, at the time though, like you're among the first planting Bordeaux reds at a commercial scale. And so the thought is, we should do Cab Sauv. Cab Sauv sells, it's going to thrive in the heat. It's probably, our Bordeaux red's going to thrive. Are they going to make it? Are we going to get them to the finish line every single year in terms of ripeness? And so, of course, you lean on Merlot because it's a little bit earlier ripening. And so that's been at least the framework we've worked in for a long time now. So the dominant variety is Merlot from a red perspective. And that in large part, that's coming from volume in the South Okanagan. So the South Okanagan probably accounts for certainly well over half of the overall acreage. So that's where the volume's coming from. The Mead Okanagan Merlot is typically fine. It's not particularly exciting unless it's in kind of the best hands and the top producers. It's not particularly exciting in ways that are intuitive. A place, it gets extremely hot, or condensed growing season. What does Merlot do? Merlot quickly loses its acidity in the heat. Quickly accumulates sugar because earlier ripening. And so we end up with these wines that are soft, fat, and very high in alcohol. I remember in the 2015 vintage, there were some Merlots at the winery I worked at that were coming in at 17, 18% potential alcohol. Phenomenal numbers. And so in the framework, and obviously the last 10 years have been a marked shift, largely driven by climate change. And it's difficult to say Merlot is the flagship because tasting the wines, it doesn't feel that way. And just intuitively on paper, from a textbook perspective, it doesn't really make sense. It's not where you'd probably plant if you were starting from scratch. So to me, Cab Sauv does really well. I'm really bullish on Cab Sauv, even though, there's mixed opinions. Like Cab Sauv retains acidity. It's later ripening. It can do well in the heat, better than Merlot. And then Syrah, of course, checks all those boxes as well. I think one of the challenges with Syrah, really the main challenge, is a question of the quality. You basically could go to any winery in the Okanagan and the Syrah is going to taste good. You would buy it. You go to a winery and sometimes you have a pity purchase because I don't want to buy empty or leave empty handed. I'm going to buy something. But you always buy the Syrah and you're like, this is probably going to be at least drinkable, which to me is like a great indication of probably this is a variety that's well suited to where it's planted. The main challenge though is very cold sensitive. And so it doesn't always make it through winters. And that was particularly pronounced over the last 2 winters. So we had extreme cold events in both December 2022, followed by January 2024. January 2024 was the harshest. So we hit temperatures, depending on where you were situated within the Okanagan, of about minus 27 to minus 30 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure how that translates to Fahrenheit, but it's A, ice cold, and B, not good news. There's few varieties that are going to thrive in those temperatures, at least from a vinifera perspective, but Syrah especially not. And so basically that killed probably, we could almost say, all of the Syrah in the Okanagan. So we have this starting point. There's probably some exceptions there, but if we're going to generalize, killed almost all of the Syrah. And so again, a marked shift. The question mark is people are like, what do we do now? Do we go back to Syrah knowing the quality is great? Or do we, you know what, we're not going to take this risk anymore. Yes, the quality is great, but so are other varieties like maybe it's Cab Sauv, maybe it's Cabernet Franc, and we're going to plant those instead because we know Cabernet Franc makes it through the winter. So we're seeing like that shift over the last kind of couple of years in terms of both the thought process and brainstorming, but then also in action as people start to replant these vineyards. The good news is, although the Syrah was wiped out after those cold events, for the most part, again, there are exceptions. We were dealing with bud loss instead of vine loss. If you look at the 2024 vintage in the Okanagan, we had about a 97% production loss So we could, again, just round up and say we had nothing. The crop we did have was largely hybrids and probably some stuff like Riesling or Cabernet Franc. It's extremely cold hardy. For the most part, we had nothing. And so that in part is underlying. We have to deal with the extreme temperatures in the summer. As it gets extremely hot, we have that extreme short condensed growing season. But now we also have to deal with the extreme temperatures in the winter and the fact that it can be extremely cold as well.
That's such a bummer for the Syrah, and that's the age-old, at least New World, not counting Australia, story for Syrahs. It always tends to taste pretty good, but it's really hard to sell, which is a bummer. But
yeah, the BC market's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is BC loves BC wine, so about 50% of wine sold in BC is BC wine. So very favorable market, and people, you're like, of course, the local market likes local wine. I think there's two background contexts there. The first is BC wine's not cheap. The average bottle of BC wine, this is a few years ago now, was about $22, $23 a bottle. That's average. So we're talking about something that's like very premium, quite expensive. So even in that context, you have strong local support. If you compare it to Ontario, the Ontario market's very different. If BC loves BC wine, Ontario does not love Ontario wine. Before the tariffs, the US tariffs, I think Ontario BQA was sitting at something like 6% market share within the province of Ontario, which was, I believe, right around a historic low. Again, it's never been huge. It was never 50% like BC, but 6% is a huge contrast to BC, where we're almost like,
wow, that's crazy. Speaking of that side of the country, do you want to briefly touch on that element or that side of Canadian wine? I know you talked about the cold hardy grapes, and I think that's probably because they were brought over from the east side where people started planting earlier. Can you talk a little bit about the whole scene there, hybrids and vitis vinifera as well?
Yeah. So, I worked in Ontario. It's where I started my career back in 2011 and went to school. I think I love Ontario wine. It's very different from BC. So I think Ontario, and in Ontario's kind of when we talk about BC, we're talking about the Okanagan. In Ontario, we're really talking about Niagara. Again, there's other regions, and I'm not trying to minimize them, but from a production perspective or importance is Niagara. In Niagara, it's kind of more of a classic cool climate. And so we're right on Lake Ontario. So you have the moderating influence of Lake Ontario. It's quite deep. It's part of Great Lakes. And so it doesn't, or rarely freezes over. So it provides that moderating influence through the winter. And then what's interesting about Niagara is you have like the escarpment. So you would generously call them hills maybe, but it's a bench that runs a few kilometers, depends where you're situated, but kilometers inland. So it provides this barrier to make sure that we're retaining that moderating influence that is coming from the lake. And again, you have our classic cool climate varieties, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling. From a market perspective, the thing to keep in mind is Ontario doesn't really love cool climate wine. Like when you look at what's one of the top export markets for California, it's Ontario. So they're more into warm climate, bold, ripe reds. And Ontario and Niagara just really do that. It can in some years, but it's can't consistently do it every single year. I mean, God knows people will still try, rightly or wrongly, to try to fill that demand. But that's where there's like this market inconsistency. But the top wines are truly world-class. I always like to say, in a lot of cases, the highs can be higher in Ontario. In part, I would say because the stakes are higher. It's a very challenging place to grow grapes, both to get them to the finish line in terms of ripeness, but also because of high humidity. It's extremely humid, which I guess Virginia, you mentioned Virginia, is extremely humid, right? So similar challenges, and then similar challenges in the sense that we had a lot of rainfall over harvest. We're talking about hurricane season. Obviously, by the time they get to Niagara, they're not hurricanes, but you can still get dumped with rain for a prolonged period of time. So you have this immense disease pressure, high risk for things like mildew, sour rot. And so if you're not good at what you do, you're probably going to be out of a job pretty quickly. And so I think you see that both like on a grower side, on a vineyard management side, but also a winemaker side as well. So I think there's this expertise that you see in Niagara. And again, I think it goes back to that mantra of top wines come from marginal places. We're places where it's not easy to make those wines necessarily. And I think Niagara checks that box. So to me, If you contrast that to the Okanagan's like easy in a sense that it's a warm, dry climate. Fruit's going to ripen, not a lot of disease pressure. There's exceptions. And obviously there's been a lot of challenges in BC, but the wines in some cases make themselves in a way that's just not true for Niagara.
That's interesting. So I know like Cab Franc grows well there. Are there, outside of that, what are the key red varieties? And then what are some of the most widely planted whites?
Yeah, so I think you would look at a list of maybe 5 signature varieties, arguably. Scale like a long list. But anyways, you would have on the red side, like Pinot Noir and Cabernet Franc. And some people would add Gamay to that list. Depends how much you care about selling wine or not, whether you add that or not. And I would say that Pinot can be world-class. It can also be a challenging place for Pinot, again, just because of the disease pressure. The highs can be high and the lows can be low. But the Cabernet Franc to me is probably at least my favorite red variety in Niagara. People often will say Cabernet Franc in the Okanagan, it could be a signature there. To me, there's just such misalignment between Okanagan and Niagara. Niagara manages to get the fruit ripe where it's not herbaceous, but still retains some of that kind of inherent greenness of Cabernet Franc, which I'm looking for, while adding some perfume and spice. Whereas in the heat of the Okanagan, it feels like we lose that a little bit. It's just like we've almost cooked those aromatics and perfume out. And so we lose, to me, some of the allure and appeal of Cabernet Franc. And the wines can just show beautifully in Niagara, more along like a Loire line, but without kind of just being light and juicy and Van de Soif, like very, very serious wines. And then Gamay, I think the top Gamays from Niagara can rival Cru Beaujolais. I guess I know is going through a bit of a renaissance and the market's coming around, probably thanks to the price of Burgundy. It doesn't feel like there's a huge market demand for those wines right now in Niagara. And then on the white side, it's basically Chardonnay Riesling, if you had to generalize. And I think the Chardonnay to me is maybe like the most exciting variety from Niagara. Just really classic, cool climate expressions of Chardonnay typically. Although they can have like very warm years, like a 2020, for example, that shows like feels almost like more California-like in style, but beautiful wines almost across the board. Pinot Chard Riesling is going to perform like very reliably, regardless of the vintage conditions. Challenge with Riesling is like no one buys Riesling. So you have this ocean of Niagara Riesling, which I love in quality or in style, I should say, is similar to Finger Lakes. Very steely, limey green apple, made in a range of different sweetness levels. But again, it's a tough sell.
I think those both are spot on. I agree. I've had some great Rieslings. And I think most recently was a Cab Franc that I was really impressed with the good herbaceousness that came from it. Like I wouldn't have guessed it was from that area, and I was pleasantly surprised. So I agree. And then that's also why I was thinking, I guess Cab Franc, maybe it does well with the humidity. Maybe that's why it's grown well in the Loire too. I never actually thought about that, but that's why Virginia, I think they're seeing success there too. It's just a hardy variety in that sense.
Both like Riesling, Cabernet Franc, extremely cold hardy. Like Niagara, at least historically, has had to deal with more extreme winters than the Okanagan, which seems to be more of like a new thing, in part coming from like polar vortex imbalances that seems like this are new normal. But certainly like Niagara, they're always looked more for hardy varieties because of that context. And you see a little bit more hybrids planted in Niagara with that in mind too. Versus like the Okanagan, there was a big shift away from hybrids. There's still some exceptions, but it's certainly the exception to what we see planted.
Yeah, that makes sense. When people are looking for Canadian wines here in the U.S., are I know the tariffs have caused the U.S. wine sales in Canada to plummet, but are you guys still exporting down here? If anybody wants to find it, are there places that are easier to find it than others? Or obviously probably Seattle, but
I think like some of the states they focused on from an export perspective have been basically Washington, New York, and California. California with limited success. But I think that's where they've put a lot of their spend and efforts. I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. If we look at the basically BC loves BC wine, the vast majority of wine sold in BC. So there's not a huge need to export. I think you have a couple of wineries they think it's important to put the best foot forward as part of their marketing efforts. And so they will export a small amount. So I think people like Meyer, for example, you'll see in some cases Blue Mountain, which do represent like some of the best in the Okanagan. But that's really the exception. For the most part, people don't export because it's a spoiled market. They're like, we're used to direct-to-consumer sales. We're used to full margin in our tasting room. And then they see, oh, this is what our ex-seller price looks like. If we export to the US, yeah, no thanks, we'll pass. And so you do see a lot of that. There's really just a number of wines that are exported. And in some cases, probably don't represent like the best of what the Okanagan's doing. To really see the best of the Okanagan, you have to visit, which from an American perspective is great because of the exchange rate. It's basically a free trip. You may as well, I guess, come to the Okanagan. And I would say, I live here, I'm biased, but it certainly is one of the most beautiful wine regions in the world to visit. I think I always come home and you don't realize we are spoiled to live here. It's an amazing place. Niagara is a little bit different. It's a softer market in Niagara, a little bit more of an export focus, a little bit more of an export focus with that in mind. And so in some cases, you'll find the wines both in the US, especially New York, but I think in the UK as well. And I think you have some of the top producers, like I think Batchelder, for example, is exporting. So you can find those wines. Again, it's a mixed bag because it's not always the best producers or the top producers that are exporting.
Interesting. So based on what you've been seeing here as we're coming up, where do you see the Canadian wine market kind of going in terms of growth, in terms of production, but also just popularity? Do you see global or more increasing Canadian demand, or is it going to be something where people maybe were producing less but higher quality? Where is the market going right now?
It's a huge point of uncertainty, I think, in both provinces. If we start with BC, it's probably sheer insanity at the moment from a couple of reasons. So we have the context of those extreme harsh winters. And so now people are challenged because they had loss of inventory, loss of production for a full year. So you had people who were making wines or sourcing grapes from Washington, Oregon, California. So we see those wines in market at the moment. So what we're labeled as, unfortunately, crafted as BC wines. A great name and kind of misleading, I would say. But to fill that gap for 1 year, it was great. You had states like Washington, Oregon to have in California, pretty significant surplus of fruits available. And then you have desperate Okanagan wineries being like, we need fruits. And that was interesting because people went to those states for the first time to source fruit. And they realized, oh, wow, this is what fruit costs down here. It's not very expensive. So people were like saving money, even with the exchange rate, which is abysmal. And they're like, not only are we saving money, we're probably sourcing better fruit and we're working with professional growers. And so I think that's interesting because moving forwards, obviously, we're a little bit limited by supply here. The Okanagan's planted to, like I said, about 11,000 acres. That's more or less our capacity. What's not planted probably shouldn't be planted. And so we have nowhere to go but just up in price over time. And that's what we've seen. But I think now after 2024, you've got wineries who are like, we can work with professional growers. We don't have to pay $6,000, $7,000 a ton for subpar fruits. So I think that'll mark an interesting shift. It's too early to make conclusions from that, but I think that'll change the direction of the industry. And I think where we're heading is higher prices, but in the context of a wine market that sucks. Obviously, consumption's down. The market's just very soft. At a certain point, if one were to guess, probably Okanagan wineries are heading to a point where they outprice the market. And it's a question of what's the outcome of that? And I think we don't know yet. And then we still have the shift of what's going to be planted over the next several years as people come out of those harsh winters. So that's the lay of the land in BC. Ontario is a little bit different because Ontario is still not selling any U.S. booze because of the tariffs. And so if you look at how Ontario BQ is doing, well, after February, huge increase in sales. I think they were up like 40% from a rock bottom 6% market share. But it was kind of like Ontario wine is like, we don't know what to do. This is unbelievable. It's never happened before. So I think you have maybe new drinkers being introduced to Ontario wine in some cases for the first time. which could mark an interesting shift. I think those sales have come back down after that initial rah-rah Go Canada in February. But I think it's going to mark potentially a big shift moving forwards with more of a place for Ontario wine. I don't think because of the production we do across the country, there are production volumes, there's never going to be a huge shift to export. It's going to be a domestic market predominantly. But I think in terms of what we're seeing from a quality perspective, Canadian wine's like never been better. You can find wine that's truly world-class. You can spend between $40 and $60 and you're going to buy a bottle of wine. It's probably going to compete at that price point. Most other regions, I would say. We're talking about Canadian dollars. I think at the low end, we can't compete under $20. So it's not where our market is. On the high end, I'll go buy Burgundy or something else instead. But I think we've really found this sweet spot between that 40, 60, maybe 40, 75 price range. And so I think it's an exciting time to drink Canadian wine just because the quality is so high and probably it's never been better than it ever has been.
Wow, perfect. If anybody is up in the area or can find some, check it out. But I guess in the medium to long term, stay tuned. See what happens. It sounds like it's going to be an interesting time.
I think so. Yeah, very dynamic. A lot's changing, and we'll just see how it goes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the time today, Geoff. This has been great. All right. That was our interview with Geoffrey Moss. I hope everybody enjoyed. I know I learned a ton about Canadian wines. If you are close to the border or visiting soon, go and grab some wines from around the country to see if you can taste the different styles that Geoff mentioned. But if not, keep your eyes peeled in your local market and see what you can find. But for now, that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another 5 questions on Friday and another full episode next week. Cheers.